The morning air inside Westminster Abbey carried a weight that went beyond the chill of the ancient stones. Hundreds of guests filled the pews, their whispers creating a soft hum that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Outside, thousands more lined the streets, craning their necks for even the briefest glimpse of royalty. But inside these sacred walls, something far more intimate was about to unfold, something that would be remembered not for its grandeur, but for its humanity. William stood near the altar, his military uniform pressed to perfection, medals gleaming under the filtered light that streamed through stained glass windows. His posture was that of a man trained from birth to command attention, yet there was a softness in his eyes as they swept across the gathered crowd. He had attended countless ceremonies, stood through endless formal occasions, but today felt different. Today, the weight of history pressed down on his shoulders with unusual force. Kate entered through the main doors, and the abbey fell into a hush so complete that even the rustle of fabric seemed loud. She moved with grace, her deep blue gown flowing behind her like water. The dress had been chosen with care, elegant but not ostentatious, respectful of the solemnity of the occasion. Her hair was styled simply, pulled back to reveal a face that showed both strength and vulnerability. She had been in the public eye for years now, photographed millions of times, yet she still possessed an ability to surprise people with her genuine presence. As she walked down the aisle, William's eyes found her immediately. It was not the casual glance of a husband noting his wife's arrival. It was something deeper, more profound. His gaze held an intensity that seemed to freeze time itself. Those close enough to see his face would later describe it as a look of pure reverence, as if he were seeing her not just as his partner, but as something precious beyond measure. The king sat in the front row, his aged hands resting on his knees, his back straight despite the years that had bent so many of his contemporaries. He had witnessed countless moments of pageantry, had himself been the subject of such gazes, but something about the exchange between his son and daughter-in-law caught his attention. His eyes, sharp despite his age, moved from William to Kate and back again. Kate reached William's side, and for a moment, the entire ceremony seemed to pause. Protocol dictated that they should face forward, that their attention should turn to the Archbishop who stood ready to begin. But William could not look away. His hand moved almost unconsciously, reaching for hers. The gesture was small, barely noticeable to most, but it spoke volumes to those who understood the language of royal restraint. The Archbishop cleared his throat gently, a subtle reminder that the ceremony must proceed. William finally tore his gaze away, but not before Kate had seen everything written in his eyes. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that cut through the formality of the moment like sunshine breaking through clouds. She had married into a world of rigid protocols and ancient expectations, but in William's eyes she always found something real, something that belonged to them alone. The ceremony began, voices rising in traditional hymns that had been sung in this space for centuries. The king watched his son carefully, noting the way William's attention kept drifting back to Kate, the way his hand remained protectively close to hers even when they were required to stand apart. It was a behavior that might have seemed improper in another context, a distraction from the solemnity of the occasion, but somehow it felt right. As the Archbishop spoke about duty and service, about the weight of responsibility that came with royal privilege, William's mind wandered. He thought about the day he had first met Kate, about the years they had spent building a relationship under the merciless glare of public scrutiny. He remembered the moments of doubt, the times when the pressure had seemed too great, when the distance between who he was supposed to be and who he wanted to be had felt unbridgeable. Kate had been his anchor through all of it. She had never asked him to be anything other than himself, had never demanded that he choose between duty and happiness. Instead, she had shown him that the two could coexist, that strength and vulnerability were not opposites but complements. She had brought normalcy into a life that was anything but normal, had reminded him that beneath the titles and the expectations, he was simply a man who wanted to love and be loved in return. The congregation rose for another hymn, and William felt Kate's shoulder brush against his. The touch was feather-light, could have been accidental, but he knew it was intentional. It was her way of saying she was there, that she understood, that they were in this together. His throat tightened with emotion, and he was grateful for the singing that covered any sound he might have made. The king observed all of this with growing interest. He had spent his life in service to the crown, had made sacrifices that few could understand, had placed duty above personal desire more times than he could count. He had loved, certainly, but always within the bounds of what was expected, what was proper. Watching his son now, he saw something different, something that both moved and slightly unsettled him. When the hymn ended and the guests settled back into their seats, the archbishop began the reading. His voice was strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the abbey. He spoke of love and commitment, of the bonds that held families together, of the responsibility that came with leadership. The words were familiar, drawn from texts that had been read at royal ceremonies for generations, but somehow today they seemed to carry new weight. William's jaw tightened as he listened. He understood duty, had been raised to understand nothing else, but he also understood something that previous generations had perhaps not fully grasped, that duty without heart was merely obligation, that service without love was simply going through motions. Kate had taught him that, had shown him by example that it was possible to honor tradition while remaining true to oneself. The ceremony continued with its carefully choreographed precision, each moment flowing into the next like movements in an ancient dance. Royal attendants moved silently through the abbey, their footsteps barely audible on the stone floor. The scent of candles mixed with the faint smell of old wood and stone, creating an atmosphere that felt timeless, as if the building itself held memories of every ceremony it had ever housed. Kate stood with perfect posture, her hands folded in front of her, her expression serene, but inside her heart was racing. She had learned to hide her nervousness, to project calm even when she felt anything but. Years of public appearances had taught her how to smile through anxiety, how to move through crowds while feeling completely overwhelmed. But William's gaze earlier had shaken something loose inside her, had reminded her that beneath all the performance, there was something real and raw. The king shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes still fixed on the couple before him. He thought about his own marriage, about the woman who had stood beside him through decades of service. They had loved each other, certainly, but it had been a different kind of love, one built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than the kind of passionate devotion he saw in his son's eyes. He wondered if that made it less valuable or simply different. A young princess seated several rows back watched the proceedings with wide eyes. She was too young to understand the full significance of what was happening, but she sensed the emotion in the room. She saw the way William kept looking at Kate, saw the small smile that played at the corners of Kate's mouth even as she tried to maintain her formal expression. The girl thought it looked like something from a fairy tale, not realizing that real life could be both more complicated and more beautiful than any story. The archbishop raised his hands, calling for a moment of prayer. Heads bowed throughout the abbey, and in that moment of collective silence, William allowed himself to truly feel the weight of what this day meant. It was not just another ceremony, another obligation fulfilled. It was a reminder of why any of it mattered, a connection to something larger than protocol and tradition. Kate felt William's presence beside her like a physical warmth. She did not need to look at him to know what he was thinking, to understand the depth of what he was feeling. They had developed a language beyond words, a way of communicating that transcended the formal constraints of their public life. In quiet moments, in stolen glances, in the brush of a hand, they spoke volumes. The prayer ended, and the congregation lifted their heads. The archbishop began the next section of the ceremony, his voice taking on a more personal tone. He spoke about the strength found in partnership, about how two people could face challenges together that would break them individually. His words were traditional, drawn from ceremonies past, but they resonated with truth. William's mind drifted to the challenges they had faced together. There had been moments of intense public scrutiny, times when every decision was dissected and criticized. There had been personal tragedies, losses that had tested their resilience. There had been the constant pressure of expectation, the knowledge that their lives were never truly their own. Through it all, Kate had remained steady, her strength quiet but unbreakable. The king thought about succession, about the future of the institution he had dedicated his life to preserving. He saw in William and Kate something that gave him hope, a modern interpretation of ancient responsibilities. They understood that the monarchy must evolve to survive, That relevance required both honoring tradition and embracing change. It was a delicate balance, one that his generation had struggled with, but they seemed to navigate it with surprising grace. Outside the abbey, the crowd waited patiently, their phones held high, ready to capture whatever moments they could. They could hear the music filtering through the heavy doors, could sense the importance of what was happening inside. Many had waited for hours. Some had traveled from distant places, all united by a fascination with royalty that transcended rational explanation. They wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves, to witness history in the making. Inside, a choir began to sing, their voices rising in perfect harmony. The music was ancient, a piece that had been performed at royal ceremonies for hundreds of years. The notes filled the abbey, soaring into the rafters, creating an atmosphere that felt almost magical. Kate closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over her, feeling it resonate in her chest. William watched her, his heart swelling with emotion. He had been taught from childhood to control his feelings, to never let them show in public. Kings and princes did not weep, did not let their guards down, did not reveal vulnerability. But in this moment he felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. The love he felt for this woman beside him was too big to contain, too powerful to hide behind protocol. The Archbishop noticed William's expression and felt a moment of concern. The young prince looked as if he might be about to break down, to let emotion overwhelm him in a very public setting. But then he saw Kate's hand move almost imperceptibly, her fingers brushing against William's sleeve. It was the smallest of gestures, barely noticeable, but it was enough. William steadied, his breathing deepening, his composure returning. The king saw it too, and something shifted in his understanding. He realized that what he was witnessing was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. William was not failing to control his emotions. He was choosing to feel them fully while still maintaining his dignity. It was a balance the king had never quite managed himself, and he felt a surge of pride mixed with something that might have been envy. The choir's song ended, the final notes hanging in the air like a benediction. The Archbishop moved to the next portion of the ceremony, inviting the royal family to step forward for a blessing. William and Kate moved together, their steps synchronized without conscious thought. They had done this so many times that their bodies knew the choreography without their minds needing to direct them. As they knelt before the Archbishop, William felt Kate's hand find his again. They were not supposed to hold hands during this part. Protocol called for them to keep their hands folded in prayer, but Kate's fingers laced through his anyway, and he squeezed back gently. Let them criticize, let them say it was improper. Some things mattered more than protocol. The Archbishop placed his hands on their heads, speaking words of blessing in Latin. The ancient language rolled over them like a wave, connecting them to centuries of tradition. William felt the weight of history pressing down, felt the expectations of generations past and future resting on his shoulders. But he also felt Kate's hand in his, warm and real and present, anchoring him to this moment. The blessing concluded, and William and Kate rose together. As they turned to return to their places, William's eyes swept across the congregation once more. He saw familiar faces, relatives and dignitaries who had been present at every major moment of his life. He saw strangers, representatives from various organizations and charities, people whose lives intersected with the royal family in countless complicated ways. But his gaze kept returning to Kate. She walked with quiet confidence, each step measured and graceful. The years had refined her natural elegance into something remarkable. When she had first entered royal life, she had been nervous, uncertain, learning as she went. Now she moved through these spaces as if she belonged there, yet she had never lost the quality that made her seem accessible, real. It was a rare gift, and William knew how precious it was. The king watched them settle back into their positions. He thought about his own wife, about the years they had spent supporting each other through the demands of royal life. She had been his partner in every sense, his confidant and advisor. But had he ever looked at her the way William looked at Kate? Had he ever allowed himself to be so vulnerable even in private? He was not certain he had, and the realization brought a melancholy he had not expected. The ceremony moved into readings from various dignitaries. A prime minister spoke about service and dedication. An archbishop from another country shared wisdom about leadership and humility. Their words were eloquent and well-crafted, designed to inspire and instruct. The guests listened politely, some more attentively than others, but the real drama of the day was happening in the small, nearly invisible exchanges between William and Kate. Kate felt the weight of dozens of cameras pointed in their direction. She knew that every expression would be analyzed, every gesture interpreted and reinterpreted. Tomorrow her dress would be discussed in detail, her jewelry examined, her hair either praised or criticized. It was exhausting sometimes, the constant scrutiny, but she had learned to let it wash over her without taking root. What mattered was not what strangers thought, but what was real between her and William. A child in the congregation began to fuss, and his mother quickly hushed him. The small disruption was barely noticeable, but it served as a reminder that beneath all the formality, this was still a human gathering. These were still people with all their imperfections and needs. William smiled slightly at the sound, remembering his own children, thinking about how they would have struggled to sit through such a long ceremony when they were younger. The king glanced at his watch discreetly. The ceremony was running long, as royal ceremonies often did. His back ached from sitting so still for so long, and he shifted slightly, trying to ease the discomfort. Getting old was not for the faint of heart, he thought wryly, but he would endure as he always had. Duty demanded no less. Kate's thoughts drifted to their children safely at home with trusted caregivers. She missed them with a sudden fierce intensity. Being apart from them always felt wrong, even for important occasions like this. But she understood that some duties required her full attention, that her role extended beyond motherhood into realms that affected millions of people. It was a balance she was still learning to strike, and some days were harder than others. The readings concluded, and the choir rose once more. This time they sang a more modern piece, something composed specifically for this occasion. The melody was beautiful, weaving traditional elements with contemporary harmonism. It was symbolic in its way, representing the ongoing evolution of an ancient institution. Some of the older guests frowned slightly, preferring the traditional hymns, but most appreciated the bridge between old and new. William listened to the music and felt himself relax slightly. The most formal portions of the ceremony were behind them now. Soon they would process out of the abbey, would face the crowds and the cameras, would smile and wave and play their parts. But for these last few minutes, they could simply be present, could absorb the atmosphere and the meaning of the day. Kate glanced at William from the corner of her eye and saw that he was looking at her again. This time his expression was different, softer somehow. There was gratitude in his eyes and something that might have been wonder. She smiled at him. A small private smile meant only for him. In a room full of hundreds of people, in a moment that would be recorded and replayed countless times, they created a bubble of intimacy that was theirs alone. The king saw the exchange and felt his chest tighten. It reminded him of moments from his own life, rare instances when the walls had come down and he had allowed himself to simply feel. Those moments had been too few, he realized now. He had been so focused on duty, on maintaining the dignity of his position, that he had sometimes forgotten to embrace the joy that was available to him. It was a regret that came with age, the understanding of opportunities missed. The archbishop stepped forward for the final blessing. His voice was gentle now, almost intimate despite the size of the space. He spoke about love as a sacred trust, about partnership as a reflection of divine grace. The words were beautiful, carefully chosen to resonate with both the deeply religious and those who attended more out of tradition than faith. William bowed his head, but his awareness remained fixed on Kate beside him. He thought about the vows they had made years ago, promises that had seemed both immense and abstract at the time. Those vows had taken on weight and texture through the years, had been tested and proven. They meant more now than they had on their wedding day, because now they understood the full scope of what they had promised. Kate felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back carefully. She could not afford to let her mascara run, could not risk looking emotional in photos that would be published around the world. But the feeling was there nonetheless, a swell of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. The blessing ended, and the congregation began to stir. The ceremony was nearing its conclusion. Soon they would be expected to move, to process out through doors that would open onto a world of cameras and crowds and expectations. But not quite yet. There was still one more moment, One more beat before the performance resumed. The Archbishop gestured for the royal family to come forward for the recessional. This was the moment when they would exit the abbey together, walking back down the aisle they had entered hours ago. It was a symbolic journey, representing both conclusion and new beginning. The king rose slowly, accepting the arm of an aide who helped him stand. Age had made these movements more difficult, though he tried to hide it. William offered his arm to Kate, the gesture formal and correct. She placed her hand on his elbow and they turned to face the long aisle stretching before them. The doors at the far end stood open now, light streaming in from outside. They could hear the roar of the crowd, muffled by distance but unmistakable in its intensity. Thousands of people waited to see them, to capture this moment for themselves. They began to walk, their pace measured and deliberate. Each step was choreographed, timed to match the music that swelled around them. The organ filled the abbey with rich, complex harmonies that seemed to vibrate through the very stones. Kate kept her head up, her expression serene, but she was intensely aware of William beside her, of the strength in the arm she held. As they passed each row, heads turned to follow them. Some people smiled, others looked moved. A few dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The emotion in the room was palpable, a collective feeling that transcended individual experience. These were people who had watched William grow up, who had followed his journey from boy to man to husband to father. They felt invested in his happiness and his success. The king fell in step behind them, walking alone as protocol demanded. His stride was still strong, still commanding, but there was a heaviness to his movements that spoke of weariness. He had carried the weight of the crown for so long, had sacrificed so much in service to duty. Watching his son now, seeing the love that radiated between William and Kate, he wondered if perhaps the price had been too high. Kate's mind was already moving forward, thinking about what came next. The balcony appearance, the photographs, the endless schedule of obligations that filled their days. But she forced herself to stay present, to absorb this moment before it slipped away. In a life filled with public performances, genuine moments were precious. She wanted to remember this feeling, wanted to hold on to it for the difficult days ahead. William felt a surge of gratitude so intense it almost stopped him in his tracks. Gratitude for Kate, for her strength and grace and unwavering support. Gratitude for the life they had built together. Imperfect and complicated, but fundamentally good. Gratitude even for the burden of responsibility that sometimes felt crushing, because it had brought him to this moment, to this realization of what truly mattered. They were halfway down the aisle now, passing the section where various dignitaries sat. Foreign royals, heads of state, ambassadors, and officials from around the world. These were the witnesses to history, people who would return to their own countries with stories about this day. Some would remember the grandeur of the ceremony, the beauty of the music, but others would remember the look in William's eyes, the tenderness between him and Kate. A photographer positioned near the altar managed to capture a shot that would later become iconic. In it, William and Kate are mid-stride, light from the open doors illuminating them from behind. Kate is looking straight ahead, regal and composed. But William is looking at her, his profile to the camera, his expression unguarded. The image would spark thousands of articles, millions of social media posts, debates about love and duty and what it meant to be royal in the modern world. The king, following behind, noticed a young couple in the congregation. They were holding hands tightly, the woman leaning slightly against the man's shoulder. They were junior members of the royal household, invited as a courtesy. The king saw in them an echo of what he was witnessing in his son, that same intensity of connection. It made him think about the choices he had made, the paths not taken. As they approached the doors, the sound from outside grew louder. The crowd's roar was deafening now, a wall of noise that represented hope and excitement and fascination. William and Kate had been through this before, had learned to steel themselves for the onslaught of attention. But it never became easy, never stopped feeling overwhelming. They simply learned to push through it. Kate squeezed William's arm gently, a signal between them. She was telling him she was there, that they would face what came next together just as they had faced everything else. He responded by placing his free hand over hers for just a moment, a touch that conveyed more than words could express. Then he released her, knowing they needed to maintain proper form for the cameras that would capture their emergence from the abbey. They stepped through the doors into brilliant sunlight. The crowd erupted, the sound hitting them like a physical force. Thousands of faces turned toward them. Thousands of phones and cameras pointed in their direction. The square in front of the Abbey was packed with people, a sea of humanity that stretched as far as they could see. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. William and Kate paused at the top of the steps, the traditional moment for photographs. They stood side by side, not touching now as protocol required. Kate's smile was perfect, practiced through years of public appearances. William's was more reserved but genuine. They waved to the crowd, acknowledging the cheers and the love being directed at them. The king emerged behind them, and the crowd's reaction intensified. He was still beloved, still commanded immense respect despite the controversies that had marked parts of his reign. He stood beside his son, 3 generations of monarchy represented in that moment. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The visible continuity of an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years. But then something happened that no one had anticipated. Something that would become the defining moment of the day. William turned to his father, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. In the king's eyes was pride and love, but also something that might have been wistfulness. In William's was respect and affection, but also determination. They were seeing each other not just as father and son, not just as monarch and heir, but as 2 men who had walked similar paths and understood costs that others could not imagine. William did something then that broke every rule of royal protocol. He stepped forward and embraced his father. It was not a formal, stiff hug for the cameras. It was a real embrace, full of genuine emotion. The king was startled at first, his body stiffening instinctively. But then he relaxed, his arms coming up to return the embrace. For just a few seconds, they were not royalty. They were simply a father and son who loved each other. The crowd fell silent, shocked by the unexpected display. Royal family members did not show such emotion in public. They maintained dignity, kept proper distance, performed their roles with precision. But William had thrown the rule book out, had chosen to prioritize human connection over protocol. It was a bold statement, a declaration that the monarchy could evolve, could embrace authenticity without losing its essential dignity. Kate watched the exchange with tears openly streaming down her face now, not caring about her mascara, not thinking about the cameras. She saw in that embrace the full measure of William's courage, his willingness to challenge traditions that no longer served. She had always known he was special, had always understood that he possessed a rare combination of strength and sensitivity. But seeing him act on it, seeing him choose love over protocol, filled her with pride that bordered on awe. The king pulled back first, his eyes suspiciously bright. He looked at his son with an expression that conveyed everything he had never been able to say, all the words that duty and tradition had kept locked inside. Then he did something equally unexpected. He inclined his head to William, a gesture of deep respect, the kind of bow a monarch rarely gave to anyone. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. The king was acknowledging something in his son that went beyond titles and succession. He was recognizing William's wisdom in choosing love, his courage in being vulnerable, his understanding that true strength came not from hiding emotions, but from having the courage to feel them fully. It was a passing of the torch, not just of power, but of philosophy. William felt his throat constrict as he watched his father bow. The king, who had spent decades maintaining the rigid formality that monarchy demanded, was showing him respect in the most public way possible. It was validation, acceptance, and blessing all wrapped into one simple gesture. William's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he kept his composure, years of training kicking in even in this emotional moment. Kate moved closer to William, her presence a steady anchor. She understood what this moment meant to him, understood the complexity of his relationship with his father. They had talked late into many nights about the burden of expectation, about the challenge of honoring tradition while forging his own path. This public acknowledgement from the king was something William had needed without fully realizing it. The crowd, after their moment of stunned silence, erupted once more. But the quality of the sound had changed. It was not just enthusiasm now, but emotion. People were crying openly, moved by what they had witnessed. In that embrace and that bow, they had seen something rarely displayed by royalty, genuine human feeling. It touched something deep within them, reminded them why they cared about these people who lived such extraordinary lives. The palace officials watching from the sidelines were less certain. Several exchanged worried glances, concerned about the breach of protocol. What would this mean for future ceremonies? Would it set a precedent that would be difficult to manage? But even they could not deny the power of what had just occurred. Sometimes they realized breaking the rules was exactly what was needed. William turned back to Kate, and she saw in his face a mixture of relief and wonder. He reached for her hand without thinking, their fingers intertwining naturally. This too was a violation of protocol. They were supposed to walk down the steps separately, maintaining proper royal distance. But William no longer cared about such things. He had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had chosen authenticity over appearance. There was no going back now. They descended the steps together, hand in hand, moving toward the waiting car that would take them through the streets. The crowd pressed against the barriers, everyone wanting to be close to them, to capture a piece of this moment for themselves. Security personnel maintained vigilant watch, but even they seemed moved by what they had witnessed. These were professionals trained to remain detached, but they were human first. The king watched them go, standing alone at the top of the steps. He felt a complex mixture of emotions swirling through him. Pride, certainly. Love deeply felt even if rarely expressed. But also a kind of grief for the walls he had maintained throughout his own life, for the distances he had kept even from those he loved most. William was choosing a different path, and the king recognized it as the better choice, even if it was one he could never fully embrace himself. Inside the car, William finally allowed himself to breathe. Kate squeezed his hand tightly, and he turned to her with a smile that transformed his face. The tension he had been carrying lifted, replaced by a lightness he had not felt in months. He had been true to himself in the most public way possible, and the world had not ended. His father had blessed his choice. It felt like permission to continue being human, even in the inhuman environment of royal life. Kate leaned her head against his shoulder, not caring that photographers with long lenses were still capturing their every move. She was tired, emotionally drained by the intensity of the ceremony and its aftermath, but she was also happy. Truly happy in a way that transcended the superficial pleasures of privilege. They had come through something important today, had publicly affirmed the values that made their partnership work. The car began to move slowly through the crowds. People waved and cheered, some running alongside the vehicle to keep them in sight for a few moments longer. William and Kate waved back, performing their duty even in this moment of private connection. But there was a new quality to their public faces now, a warmth that had not always been visible before. The walls between their private selves and their public personas had thinned. Back at the Abbey, the king was being helped into his own car. His private secretary hovered nearby, clearly wanting to discuss what had just happened but uncertain how to broach the subject. The king waved him off, wanting a few moments of silence to process his own thoughts. He looked out the window at the celebrating crowd, at the joy on their faces, and felt something shift inside him. He had spent so long believing that emotion was weakness, that maintaining distance was essential to maintaining respect. But watching William embrace vulnerability and seeing how the people responded, he began to wonder if he had been wrong. Perhaps true strength lay not in walls but in bridges, not in isolation but in connection. It was a difficult thought for a man who had built his entire life on different principles, but he could not dismiss it. The drive to the palace took them through streets lined with well-wishers. William and Kate continued to wave, but between waves their hands found each other again. They had learned to steal moments of genuine connection, even in the most public circumstances. It was a skill born of necessity, developed over years of having their private lives constantly invaded by public curiosity. Kate thought about the moment when William had embraced his father. She had been surprised, certainly. William was usually careful about protocol, mindful of the expectations placed on him. But she had also been thrilled, seeing it as evidence that her influence on him was positive, that she was helping him become more fully himself rather than just a symbol. It validated her presence in his life in a way that went beyond titles and position. William's mind was already moving forward, thinking about what would come next. There would be criticism, certainly. Conservative voices would complain about the breach of protocol, would warn about the dangers of making the monarchy too common. But he suspected that more people would be moved than offended, that the public was ready for a royal family that felt more human and accessible. They arrived at the palace gates, passing through into the protected space beyond. The noise of the crowd faded somewhat, muffled by the high walls and the distance. William felt a sense of relief at the temporary reprieve from public scrutiny, but he also felt energized, ready to face whatever challenges his choice might bring. He had crossed a Rubicon today, had publicly declared his values. There was liberation in that, even as it brought new complications. Kate and William exited the car and walked into the palace together, still hand in hand. Staff members stood at attention, their faces carefully neutral, but William caught glimpses of approval in some eyes, warmth that had not been there before. Even among the household staff, people were moved by what they had witnessed. Change was coming, whether the old guard liked it or not. They made their way to a private room, a brief respite before the next round of public appearances. The moment the door closed behind them, William pulled Kate into his arms. They stood there for a long moment, not speaking, just holding each other. Words were unnecessary. They had shared something profound today, had navigated troubled waters together and emerged stronger for it. Kate finally spoke, her voice muffled against his chest. She told him how proud she was, how moved she had been by his courage. William held her tighter, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. He had spent so much of his life worrying about doing the right thing, about meeting expectations, about not disappointing those who depended on him. Today, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had been true to himself without apology. There was a knock at the door, a gentle reminder that their private moment could not last. They had obligations waiting, schedules to keep, appearances to make. But they had also proven something to themselves today. They had shown that it was possible to be both royal and real, to honor tradition while embracing change. It was a balance they would continue to navigate for the rest of their lives, but today had given them confidence that they were moving in the right direction. William released Kate reluctantly, and they turned to face the door together. Whatever came next, they would face it as they always had, as partners. The world outside might judge them, might criticize or praise, but what mattered most was the understanding they shared. In a life defined by public scrutiny, they had created something private and precious, something that belonged only to them. The door opened, and an aide entered with the schedule for the rest of the day. There were more appearances, more photographs, more performances required. William and Kate listened, nodded, prepared themselves mentally for what lay ahead. But underneath the public faces they would wear, underneath the smiles and waves and practiced responses, they carried with them the memory of this day, of this moment, when everything had changed. The balcony appearance came 2 hours later, the final public moment of a day that had already become historic. William and Kate stood behind the heavy curtains, listening to the roar of the crowd gathered in the square below. They had done this dozens of times before, had perfected the timing and the choreography, but today felt different, charged with an energy that went beyond routine ceremony. The king joined them, moving slower than he once had, but still commanding presence. He positioned himself between William and Kate, the three of them forming the image that photographers and historians would capture for posterity. But before the curtains opened, the king did something unexpected. He reached out and took both their hands, squeezing gently. It was a private gesture, one that no cameras would capture, one meant only for them. William looked at his father in surprise. The king's eyes were softer than usual, the formal mask slipping to reveal the man beneath. He spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise from outside. He told William that he had been brave today, that he had shown a kind of leadership that the monarchy needed. The words were simple, but they carried weight that went beyond their surface meaning. They were an acknowledgement, a benediction, a passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. Kate felt tears threaten again, but controlled them. This was not the time for emotional display, not when thousands waited to see them, but she tucked the moment away in her heart, knowing that William would need to return to it in the days ahead. Change was never easy, especially change within an institution as resistant to it as the monarchy. There would be pushback, criticism, debate, but they had the king's blessing now, spoken in private but real nonetheless. The curtains opened and they stepped out onto the balcony. The noise from the crowd was deafening, a wall of sound that hit them physically. The square was packed beyond capacity, people standing shoulder to shoulder, filling every available space. Flags waved, cameras flashed, voices joined together in celebration. This was what royal moments looked like from the outside, grand and overwhelming and larger than life. William raised his hand to wave, and Kate did the same. They smiled and acknowledged the crowd, playing their parts with practiced ease. But William's mind was partially elsewhere, thinking about what today had set in motion. He had broken with protocol in a very public way, had chosen emotional truth over formal correctness. The consequences of that choice would ripple outward in ways he could not fully predict. The king stood between them, waving to his people. He looked every inch the monarch, dignified and composed. But inside, his thoughts were complex. He was watching his son navigate waters he himself had never dared to enter, make choices that would have been impossible in his own youth. Part of him envied that freedom, even as another part worried about the risks. But mostly he felt pride. His son was braver than he had been, more willing to be vulnerable, more committed to authenticity. Kate glanced at William and caught his eye. They shared a look that communicated volumes, a private moment within a very public spectacle. She saw in his face a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion, the toll that emotional honesty took when combined with public performance. She understood completely, feeling the same dichotomy herself. They were living in two worlds simultaneously, the private and the public, constantly negotiating the space between them. Below, in the crowd, people were already sharing videos and photos on social media. The embrace between William and his father, the king's beau, William and Kate holding hands, every moment was being dissected and discussed. Opinions were forming, narratives being constructed. Some praised the display of emotion as refreshing and human. Others criticized it as inappropriate, a degradation of royal dignity. The debate would continue for days, weeks, perhaps longer. But up on the balcony in that moment, none of that mattered. William felt Kate's presence beside him like a constant reassurance. He felt his father's approval, hard-won but deeply meaningful. He felt the weight of responsibility that came with his position, but also a new sense of freedom. He had proven to himself that it was possible to be both prince and person, to fulfill duty while honoring heart. The appearance lasted 15 minutes, long enough to satisfy the crowd's desire to see them, short enough to maintain the sense of occasion. As they turned to go back inside, William took one last look at the sea of faces below. These were the people he served, the reason for all the protocol and ceremony. But they were also human beings who responded to human emotion, who wanted to see themselves reflected in their leaders. Inside the palace, the formal mask could drop somewhat. Family members gathered in a reception room. The atmosphere relaxed despite the formality of the occasion. Children ran between adults, their laughter a welcome contrast to the solemnity of the day. William scooped up his youngest, spinning her around as she giggled. Kate watched with a smile, seeing the man she loved in his most natural element. Surrounded by family, the king sat in a high-backed chair, accepting congratulations and making small talk with various relatives. But his eyes kept returning to William and Kate, watching how they moved through the room together, how they seemed to orbit each other even when speaking to different people. It was a connection he had rarely achieved in his own marriage, a partnership that went beyond duty into something more profound. An elderly aunt approached Kate, taking her hand warmly. She spoke about how moving the ceremony had been, how wonderful it was to see such genuine affection displayed. Kate thanked her graciously, but she was thinking about what the comment revealed. Even within the family, emotional expression was rare enough to be remarkable. They had all been trained from birth to hide feelings, to maintain control, to never let the mask slip. William's public embrace of his father had shocked them all. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, William found himself alone with his father for a moment. They stood by a window looking out over the darkening gardens. The king spoke about change, about how institutions must evolve to survive. He admitted that he had not always understood this, had clung too tightly to tradition at times. But watching William today, seeing how the public responded to genuine emotion, had taught him something. William listened quietly, moved by his father's honesty. The king was not given to introspection, rarely admitted doubt or uncertainty. This conversation was a gift, an offering of wisdom hard-earned through years of experience. William thanked his father, his voice thick with emotion. They shook hands formally, but then the king pulled him into another embrace, this one private and unhurried. Kate found them like that and paused in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. She saw in that embrace the healing of old wounds, the bridging of distances that had existed for too long. William and his father had always loved each other, but love within royal families was complicated by duty and expectation. Today had cleared some of that complication away, had created space for more authentic connection. The king left soon after, pleading fatigue. William and Kate were finally alone, the long day drawing to a close. They walked through the palace corridors hand in hand, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. Portraits of ancestors looked down at them, centuries of monarchs who had navigated their own challenges and changes. William wondered what they would think of today, whether they would approve or condemn his choices. In their private quarters, they finally relaxed completely. Kate kicked off her shoes with a sigh of relief, and William loosened his tie. They collapsed onto a sofa together, the exhaustion of the day catching up with them, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from meaningful effort rather than empty performance. They had accomplished something today, had moved the needle in important ways. William pulled Kate close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, processing everything that had happened. The ceremony, the embrace, the bow, the balcony appearance, each moment had carried significance. But what mattered most was what those moments represented, the values they had publicly affirmed, the kind of leadership they had modeled. Kate spoke softly about their children, about how they would tell them about this day someday. She wanted them to understand that being royal did not mean being inhuman, that duty and authenticity were not opposites but complements. William agreed, thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave, not just in terms of policy or protocol, but in terms of what it meant to live with integrity. The palace around them settled into night, lights dimming, staff retiring, the bustle of the day fading into quiet, but William and Kate remained awake, talking softly about the future they hoped to build. They spoke of modernizing the monarchy while respecting its history, of making it relevant to new generations while honoring old traditions. It was a delicate balance, one they would spend the rest of their lives navigating. But after today, they felt ready for the challenge. They had proven that change was possible, that vulnerability could be strength, that love belonged even in the most formal of institutions. The world had watched them choose each other, choose honesty, choose to be fully human despite the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. And in doing so, they had offered a vision of what the monarchy could become. Not a relic of the past, but a living institution that,